A disaster that sounds like a joke until you hear the bodies counted. If you saw the headline, "Beer Floods London," you might smile. It sounds like a joke, like one of those fun facts on the internet. A wall of beer crashing through the streets, people running with buckets, a river of free alcohol. But on one October evening in 1814 that headline was real, and by the time the beer stopped flowing, 8 people were dead. Imagine you live in a single, cramped room in a London slum. You're cooking a thin stew for your children. The air smells of coal smoke and sewage. Above you, the city roars with carriages and distant bells. Then you hear it. A sound like thunder, but wrong. A deep, rolling crack, like a giant piece of the world just snapped in half. Your walls tremble. Your dishes rattle. Before you can move, your door explodes inward and a black wave slams into you. It isn't water. It's porter. Strong, dark beer. Beer taller than a grown man. Beer moving fast enough to smash through brick. In the space of a heartbeat, your home becomes a barrel, and you're the thing trapped inside. This is the story of the Great Beer Flood of London. A night when a brewery tank burst, when 1.4 million liters of beer tore through one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, and when a disaster that sounds like comedy turned into a quiet tragedy almost nobody remembers. The night beer flooded London's streets. Welcome to Night History for Sleep, where we tell the kind of stories that sound too strange to be real, but come straight from the archives. Tonight's story is about beer, industry, and the lives that get crushed, literally, when something goes badly wrong. There's no graphic detail here, but there is death, neglect, and the kind of casual cruelty that only shows up after the headlines fade. If you like slow, dark, true stories, while you drift off, stories that stay with you, the next morning, you can subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's step back before the vats burst, before the screams, back to a London that was almost drunk by design. London, 1814. The Napoleonic Wars are dragging toward their bloody conclusion. The city is swelling with people, workers, soldiers, widows, migrants, crammed into every possible space. The air is thick. Coal smoke hangs low over the rooftops. The Thames is more sewer than river. Cholera hasn't been discovered yet, but the water is already trying to kill you. In a place like this, beer isn't just a luxury, it's survival. Boiled, brewed, fermented, beer is often safer to drink than water. Children drink weak beer. Adults drink strong porter. Workers take their wages and head straight to the tavern. And behind those taverns is a new kind of giant, the industrial brewery. Porter, dark, strong, and cheap, has become the taste of London's working class. To keep up with demand, breweries start building enormous storage vats. Not barrels you can roll by hand, but wooden tanks so big that you could throw a party inside them. One of the kings of this booming business is Moo & Company's Horseshoe Brewery, on the corner of Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street. From the street, you'd see brick walls, tall chimneys, and the constant in and out of drays, heavy wagons hauling barrels. From above, the brewery is a little city inside the city. Boiling coppers belch steam. Coopers hammer iron hoops onto barrels. Men shovel malt, stir mash, and walk along high wooden catwalks between the vats. Near the center of this complex stands its proudest symbol, a gigantic vat of porter, towering over the men who tend it. It's not romantic, it's not elegant, but in 1814, it's a symbol of modern power. The vat is roughly 22 feet high, about the height of a 2-story house. Inside, it holds more than 3,500 barrels of beer. That's over 1 million liters, more liquid than most people in the neighborhood will ever see in one place, held back only by thick wooden staves, and dozens of iron hoops cinched tight around them. If you worked here, like many did, you might feel two things when you looked at it: pride and a very quiet kind of fear. Because if that thing ever burst, what would it sound like? What would it do? Let's imagine one of the men tending that vat. We don't know his name. The records of laborers rarely survive, so we'll call him Thomas. Thomas is in his 30s, strong from years of carrying sacks of barley. He breathes in steam and yeast and wood dust every day. When he looks up at the great porter vat, he doesn't see engineering genius. He sees a thing that creaks, because wood swells and shrinks. Iron warps. Beer moves. The vat has been there for years. It's already survived one near disaster. Only a few days before the flood, one of the massive iron hoops on the vat slipped off with a crash. Workers jumped. Managers came running, but the vat held. Porter didn't spill. No one died. The brewer's management sighed with relief. Replacing the hoop would be expensive. Draining the vat would be even worse. A fortune in beer poured away. So instead, they did what people often do when faced with a risk that hasn't killed them yet. They told themselves, "It's fine. They propped the hoop up. They kept brewing. They trusted that if it hadn't broken before, it probably wouldn't. Meanwhile, pressure continued to rise inside that colossal wooden stomach. Porter is alive. Even after fermentation, gases shift, bubbles rise. Wood flexes under the sheer weight of thousands of barrels worth of liquid pressing outward. You can almost think of that vat as an animal. Huge, restless, held in check by hoops that are just a little too old. In a building that's just a little too flimsy, sitting beside one of the most crowded slums in London. Because that's the other half of this story. Behind the brewery wall lies St. Giles, a maze of narrow alleys, crumbling tenements, and overcrowded cellars. It's sometimes called a rookery, like a nesting place for crows. Families stack on top of families. Rooms that should hold 2 people hold 10. Many are recent Irish immigrants, living on casual labor and hope. The wall of the Horseshoe Brewery is one of the few solid things in their world. They sleep with their backs almost literally against it. None of them know that on the other side, an iron hoop has slipped. None of them have a say in whether that vat stays full. They just hear, every day, the comforting sounds of brewing, the clatter of barrels, the slosh of beer, the low rumble of carts. On October the 17th, 1814, that soundscape changes, but only for an instant. It's late afternoon on a Monday. In the brewery, Thomas and the other men move through their routines. Outside, London is settling into evening. Shops are closing. Smoke is rising from 1,000 cook fires. The sky is turning the color of weak tea, heavy with soot. Somewhere in St. Giles, in a basement cellar, an Irish family is holding a wake for a child who died days earlier. There's a small coffin, candles, quiet murmured prayers. They rent this dim, low room not because it's ideal, but because it's all they can afford. Far overhead, in the great vat, the porter presses outward. Wood strains, iron groans. Nobody hears that. What they hear, just after 5:30 in the evening, is something else entirely. A boom. A single, enormous crack followed by a roar. To Thomas inside the brewery, it feels like the building has been hit by a cannon. The great vat bursts, not slowly, not with a leak you can plug. The wooden staves explode outward. Tons of beer surge free, all at once. Imagine standing next to a wall that suddenly becomes a liquid hand, slapping you aside. The force of the rupture is so great that it triggers a chain reaction. Nearby vats, smaller but still huge, are shaken. Their supports fail. In the space of seconds, more beer joins the first wave. In modern estimates, about 323,000 gallons, over 1 million liters, of porter are now moving, all together. Inside the brewery, brick walls shatter. Heavy barrels are tossed around like toys. Workers are knocked off their feet. Outside, on the other side of that brick boundary, St. Giles has no warning. The first sign is a sudden, suffocating smell. Rich, malty, bitter. Then the sound, a rolling crash that doesn't stop. Then the sight. If you'd been standing in one of those narrow alleys, you might have looked up and seen a *** dark wall ** taller than a man filling the passageway, carrying broken timber, bricks, and shattered barrels with it. People later described a wave, 15 feet high, not clear and blue like in paintings, but brown-black, foaming, with shards of wood in its belly. When it hits the fragile houses backing onto the brewery, the houses lose. Walls cave in, floors give way. Thin brick and rotten beams never had a chance against industrial beer. In seconds, whole rooms are filled. Basements, they become wells. Anyone in a cellar is now in a sealed tank. We can try to imagine, for a moment, what that was like from the inside. You're one of the mourners at the child's wake in that basement room. The air is already close. Candles burning, too many bodies for the space. The priest is speaking, or maybe someone's just telling stories, trying to lighten the strangled grief of a parent. Then the floor shakes. Someone stumbles. Dust falls from the ceiling. You hear shouting from outside. A crash. Pain, maybe, before anyone can reach the stairs. Beer bursts through the doorway. Cold, sudden, violent. The candles go out. In total darkness, you feel your feet swept out from under you. The small coffin knocks against your leg and is gone. You try to stand, but the ceiling is low, the room packed, the current fast. People scream and swallow porter instead of air. Upstairs, in ground floor rooms, it's hardly better. Walls bow inward as the swell hits. A woman cooking dinner turns and sees half her kitchen turn liquid. Her table is gone, the pot is gone, the door is gone. She grabs a child and is slammed against the remaining wall, pinned there by the force. In the narrow street, a teenage servant girl, working at a nearby tavern, doesn't even see the wave coming. The wall of the adjoining building blows out, bricks smashing into her, killing her almost instantly. For others, death isn't that quick. When the wave finally loses its momentum, what's left behind is a nightmare. Water would eventually seep away, down drains, back into the earth. Beer lingers. It fills low spaces, cellars, and basements, waist deep, chest deep. Broken timber floats on top. Shards of glass, splintered chairs, loose bricks. People who survive the first hit find themselves neck deep in a choking, sticky flood, in the dark, with no clear way out. Neighbors hear the first screams and rush to help. But what can you do when the entire street is full? How do you know which collapsed room holds a living person, and which holds a drowned one? Later, some newspapers would hint that crowds came just to drink, that people rushed in with mugs and pails. There were, undoubtedly, those who tried to scoop beer from the gutters. This is London in 1814. A day's worth of alcohol, free on the ground, is a temptation for men who work themselves to the bone. But if you focus only on that, you miss the bodies. You miss the families dragging stunned survivors onto higher ground. The cries of mothers who can't find their children. The impossible weight of a fallen wall when your own hands are the only ones you have. When the sun finally sets that evening, it sinks on a neighborhood that has been literally flattened by drink. Not the way moralists warn about. Not from slow addiction or wasted wages, but from a single engineering decision gone horribly, violently wrong. When disasters hit poor neighborhoods, the official record is often thin. We don't have a perfect list of every injured person in St. Giles that night, but we do know how many died. 8. 8 doesn't sound like much compared to great fires or plagues or wars, but 8 is everything if one of them is your child. The dead include children caught in their homes, too small to fight the flood, a teenage servant girl killed at work when a wall collapsed on her, women in the cellars and kitchens of their own homes, swept away or crushed under beams. One of the saddest scenes described in later accounts is that Irish wake in the basement. Everyone gathered there to mourn one dead child. They didn't know they would join him. The room they'd chosen as a final gesture of respect became a beer-filled tomb. The image is almost cruel in its symbolism.
A child already taken by the brutality of life in a London slum, and then a random industrial accident comes and wipes out the mourners too. Above ground, the wreckage is bitterly ironic. Some buildings that backed onto the brewery are now just open shells, facing the street like cracked ceramics. You can stand in what used to be someone's bedroom and look out at a yard still slick with beer. The next day, crowds come, partly to help, partly to stare. Human beings have always slow walked toward disasters, drawn by a morbid gravity. Local pubs are overwhelmed, not by drinkers, but by people needing space, information, a place to sit and shake. And it's there, in a public house, not a courthouse, not a grand hall, that the inquest into the deaths is held. A coroner's inquest in 1814 is part legal process, part public theater. Witnesses describe what they saw. Brewery staff explain the bursting vat. Neighbors talk about the wave, the noise, the walls falling. Everyone agrees on one thing. It was sudden. It was catastrophic. It was horrifying. But was it anyone's fault? That's a different question. When a disaster is this strange, people reach for explanations. Some are religious, some are technical, some are just convenient. At the inquest, the jury hears that a hoop had slipped off the great vat before, but the brewery assures them this is normal. Hoops slip, vats creak. It happens all the time. No one thought the vat would explode. No one intended harm. They hear that Moo & Co. are reputable brewers. That accidents, while tragic, are a part of modern industry. The dead, of course, are poor. Their families don't have lawyers. They don't own newspapers. They don't sit in parliament. In the end, the jury returns a verdict that would be familiar in many other industrial tragedies. The deaths are deemed the result of a visitation of God, an act of God, not of man, not of negligence. A strange phrase, if you think about it, as if divine will had personally removed that iron hoop, weakened those timbers, and directed the flood into the poorest housing on the street. It's a neat verdict. It means the brewery is not legally responsible for the deaths. They are spared from paying compensation on any meaningful scale. Yet Moo & Co. are in financial trouble anyway. The beer was expensive. The damage to the brewery is enormous. They go to the government and argue that they should be relieved of some of the taxes they had already paid on the beer that was lost. And in a dark twist, they succeed. The company is granted a remission of duty. The disaster actually helps their balance sheet. The people of St. Giles bury their dead. The brewery repairs its walls. In a few years, to most of London, the Great Beer Flood is old news. Life in the rookery goes back to the same grinding, precarious normal. Work, rent, hunger, and beer, once again, safely contained in barrels and vats. Time does something strange to tragedies. It smooths them out, turns sharp edges into anecdotes. A century after the Great Beer Flood, People begin to tell the story with a smile. A whole street flooded with beer. Imagine the drunks. Best day ever, right? Cartoons get drawn of happy Londoners scooping up foamy porter in their hats. The victims vanish. Their names barely appear in most retellings. Jokes about the flood become a kind of class comedy. The respectable middle class, chuckling at the thought of the poor literally drowning in the thing they stereotype them for loving. The breweries, pointing to the story as a freak accident, a curiosity of their history.
Only when you go back to the original reports, the coroner's documents, the death registers, do the dead step quietly back into the picture. A 4-year-old girl, a teenage servant, mothers and wives whose lives were circled by the walls of St. Giles and ended in a wave of beer. We don't have their letters or diaries. We don't know what they dreamed of. We only know how they died, where they lived, and where their bodies were taken. It tells you something about how history remembers things. If a disaster is unusual enough, it survives as trivia, a rain of frogs, a sugar explosion, a beer flood. But if the victims are poor and powerless, their individual stories do not attach themselves to the event. The spectacle does. The humor does. The human cost evaporates, like spilled beer on a hot pavement. So what do we do with a story like this? On one level, it's just that, a story, a weird disaster from 2 centuries ago. But if you look a little closer, it's also a perfect snapshot of how industrial societies learn and who they choose to protect. The Great Beer Flood sits at the intersection of 3 things: technology pushed to its limits, lax safety culture, communities with no power. Moo & Co. weren't uniquely evil. They were normal for their time, proud of their massive vats, proud of their efficiency, proud of the river of porter they sent across the city every day. They probably genuinely believed that what they were doing was a kind of progress. Bigger vats meant cheaper beer. Cheaper beer meant more customers. More customers meant more steady work for the men who hauled the barrels. But progress, as history shows, usually has unseen risks. In this case, the risk wasn't spread equally. The brewery itself was made of solid brick. The people living right behind it were not. When the accident came, the cost was not paid by the directors of Moo & Co. or the officials who wrote the building codes. It was paid by the people who lived in the shadow of the walls. Poor, Irish, working class.
If you zoom out further, the flood also sits in a long line of disasters in which companies and governments have tried to call something an act of God, when it might just as fairly be called an act of ambition, carelessness, or greed. In 1814, those words closed the legal book on the beer flood. Today, when you hear about a factory collapse, a chemical spill, or a dam failure, you might listen for similar language. We had no way of knowing. It was unpredictable. No one is to blame. Maybe sometimes that's true, but more often, something like this has already happened somewhere else. A hoop has already slipped off a vat, and someone chose to keep filling it. The Great Beer Flood of London is the kind of event people like to turn into a punchline. A river of beer in the streets. Imagine that. But on that October night in 1814, the people of St. Giles didn't get a joke. They got a shock, a roar, and a wall of dark liquid that didn't care whether they drank or not. If you remember anything from this story, I'd suggest it's this. Whenever you hear a strange, funny-sounding piece of history, there's almost always someone's real life behind it. A child who didn't grow up, a worker who didn't come home, a family that never got an apology. If you've listened this far, thank you for sitting with this story. If you like long, quiet explorations of the darker corners of the past, told slowly enough to fall asleep to, but clearly enough to remember in the morning, you can subscribe to Night History for sleep and tap the bell so you don't miss the next episode. Had you heard of the London beer flood before? Did you think of it as a joke? Or did you already know that people died? Tell me in the comments. I read as many as I can, and your suggestions often become the next story we tell here. Until then, rest well. And the next time you see a fun little history fact, you might wonder what's hiding underneath the laughter.